afternoon, everybody. My name is Kyle Chong. I'm the lone non-PhD on the panel and the lone person of color on the panel. The title of my talk today is going to be entitled Playful Practice, the Democratic Potential of Reacting to the Past as Experiential Learning. So, you know, in my life, I've played a lot of roles. I've had a lot of titles. Some give me power, some give me privilege, others not so much. Some of those roles include being a graduate, an Asian American, an adoptee, a male. Other identities and roles have been a little bit more temporary. An aristocrat, a gendarme, a senator, even a 15-year-old Sicilian girl. Now those identities were during a game of reacting to the past, and I'm here to talk to you today about how this role-playing pedagogy and this playful practice has a potential for democratic engagement, learning democratic engagement, and public practices of resistance. So I'm going to be addressing the conference sub-theme of radical transformations, new publics, and new social contracts. And I want to counteract this notion that Pierre Bourdieu forwards, that the school has to be a conservative force. And I want to go beyond this idea of just civic engagement, but radical practices of reckoning with injustice. But first, let me slow down and tell you a little bit about what is reacting to the past. Reacting to the past is a role-playing game in which students are given historical characters, and these games are set at political, social, or cultural junctures. Reacting games are set in Athens in 403 BCE, France in 1791, China in 1587, or India in 1945. And they center around a set of primary and core texts, things like Rousseau's Second Discourse, Confucius's Analects, Plato's Republic, among others. Now, Jeff Chang yesterday talked about this idea of culture wars playing out in the streets. But can we practice our response as people coming from marginalized discourses or narratives before these culture wars have to play out in the streets? And I argue that this practice, this playful practice, can be both fun, serious, engaged, and of course, democratic. So the games will, again, focus on character role-playing, and often characters and students are cast in character roles that often feature opinions that are radically different or opposing from their own, which again is practiced in that ideological dissonance between the student self, which I'll refer to a little bit more later, and the character self. So Mark Carnes, the creator of the Reacting to the Past pedagogy, and his seminal work on the pedagogy called Minds on Fire, talks about how our predominant pedagogical system is rational, hierarchical, individualistic, and well-ordered, and that we often don't prioritize the aspects of the self relating to emotion, our mischievous subversion, our social engagement, our creative disorder. Now, I think what is really interesting about this character role play is the ability to transcend this present self. The student stops at the door. Once we're in the game, you are your character. I am Cicero. I am the gendarme. Don't mess with me. Now, we use costuming and these ideas of notional role-playing as a means of marking that differentiation. This is no longer a classroom. This is the Athenian Assembly, the French National Assembly. When we teach, or in my case, precepting these games, are trying to accomplish is a safe space to play with disorder, a safe experience in the chaos of radicalism. Now, but why is role-playing and gameplay a radical reimagination of the project of justice, especially when we can be learning about these marginalized narratives during the 3 weeks that it takes to play one of these games? And especially because, as people like Bernie Sanders might point out, that politics is a serious endeavor involving the fates of nations, ideals, and human beings who cannot afford to be pawns in a game. My answer is because it teaches critique, it teaches empathy, but most importantly, it teaches interdisciplinary legibility. Now that's a buzzword. But what I hope that the character role play and the embodiment of a different self encourages is that the student subverts this idea of a dilettante, an idealized academic subject in which disciplinary mastery in the academic market is a form of competitive advantage. That is, we need to encourage our students to explore the breadth and capacity of their educations, or as Wendy Brown might say, to bridge the gaps between the separated silos of disciplinary mastery. So I want you to imagine for a second what it means to play Jefferson Davis or Emma Goldman as a student. The idea that, as the embodiment and role-playing pedagogy panel talked about yesterday, that what does it mean to put on the mask? What does it mean to do that literally in the form of notional role-playing or costuming? Or what does it mean to be a character immersed in this uncontrollable space where a character's outcomes are the only guiding principles to determine a character's success within a game? What I think is most interesting that this pedagogy exposes is that professors are not the indisputable authority in the classroom during the space of the game. The faculty become this kind of disembodied role of Athena or the game master that brings the faculty outside of the classroom and allows the students to run the class themselves. And so in so doing, we're freeing our students from their disciplinary methodologies because these games have an inherently interdisciplinary quality. But in so doing and freeing our students from their disciplinary methodological approaches, we might also free them from the fundamental assumptions that a discipline makes and what kind of new and exciting and chaotic learning is made accessible as a result. And so as Elisa Kessel mentions in her 2014 article, Moving Beyond Moser, she talks about this idea that the embodiment of difference alters one's encounter with it. That means we don't, in our public spheres, in our simulated and constructive, subversive publics that are reacting to the past, our encounter with difference does not have to be difference in and of itself. That is, we don't encounter difference simply because they look other. These are characters, formerly students, that become people who might look familiar or sound familiar. And the encounter with difference is then a difference in argument, as opposed to a difference in biology or identity. And so I want to situate then reacting to the past as a pedagogical approach within the kind of conventional wisdom on experiential learning, both within what is working and what isn't working. So the first thing that I think is working really well about current scholarship on experiential learning is skill development practicums. That is, like in a lot of disciplines, we have an opportunity to practice our skills. That is, a neurobiologist or a physical therapist or musicologist gets to actually practice those theoretical concepts. But how do we do that in the social sciences or humanities? It's a little bit less clear. And so reacting to the past as a role-playing and affective game experience and the immersive quality within a constructed, simulated public allows for our professionalization or professionalism of our students to practice their argument, rhetoric, and logic, also known as the liberal arts trivium. We also are, I argue that the reacting to the past pedagogy is congruent with George Koo's and the AAC and U's high-impact learning pedagogy, insofar as learning communities involve a seminar-style classroom, writing-intensive classes, and dialogical engagement between students in the classroom. And thus, by encouraging our students to really embody the mask, the role, it expands this identity of student, where again, it's not about disciplinary hyper-specialization, but it's about affect and empathy with those across the aisle. So I also want to talk about what isn't working within the experiential model. I would argue that it doesn't just have to be internships in terms of what we consider to be experiential learning. It also, a lot of people say that experiential learning might make more sense in the hard sciences. So again, those practicums for our neurobiologists, musicologists, or physical therapists in the room. But I also want to address an ideological divide within scholarship on experiential learning, which is the difference between, as George Koo might put it, a steady fire, or Mark Carnes might put it, hot passion. Now, the idea is that a steady fire, persistent engagement with a text, civic engagement, student engagement, etc., is very much in line with the broader arc of the National Survey on Student Engagement, also known as the Loch Nessie Monster to the skeptics, is constructed. And so then, but I think what George Koo, and I think that's a fine principle, but I think what George Koo doesn't always acknowledge, and what Mark Carnes rightly identifies, is that hot passion can in fact be a trigger for a steady fire. That is, a 3-week engagement and immersion within a character might be just enough to get a student involved for the rest of their academic career. And so thus, when we see like a common critique of experiential learning being that the space might be too controlled, the outcomes might be too packaged, when we introduce a little bit of creative disorder, our playful practice becomes then one in which the student is kind of grasping for a way to survive within the game. And so we arrive at these students in these embodied character roles in a newly constructed, temporally and spatially alien identity. That is, what gets shaken loose when you embody a character is that you're shaken from those comfortable, rigid identities. You're shaken from yourself. It's taking a risk in the classroom. It's not comfortable for some students, but it also necessarily introduces discomfort so that we might recenter our discourse around narratives that have been otherwise marginalized, silenced, or excluded from our curriculum. And so, but I also want to understand and acknowledge that there are some reasonable counter-arguments to the radical potential of reacting to the past. That you're subverting the student to become what? And I would argue that it really depends on the kind of role-playing you're doing. So what we're doing in reacting is, again, destabilizing. It has a destabilizing characteristic to subvert a rigid student identity. As in, again, you are not entering the classroom as student. But there's also bad versions of role-playing in an educational and strictly pedagogical sense. There's a game, first-person shooter video game called Active Shooter that simulates school shootings and mass police violence that was taken off Steam in May of this year, which I don't think it's hard to imagine how that is necessarily uneducational. But also we have pedagogies like Dungeons and Dragons, which are almost never seen in an educational context because the transcendence, that is the suspensive quality of these games, are not replaced with anything else. You just become a character and you have fun. Trust me, I have fun playing D&D. But there is a gray area, though, with pedagogies like Model United Nations and Mock Trial, where there is a suspensive quality where the student is no longer a student, but a lawyer or a diplomat. But the caution that I have, and the hesitation I have with MUN and Mock Trial, is that there is a sense that there is no temporal insulation. That is, the historical context of the game prevents the pervasion and penetration of present political logic within the game sphere, corrupting the nature of the argument and engagement with the text as it was intended. So now I've arrived at, hopefully, I'm going to make these 2 points salient, that role-playing games are teachable for teaching durable democratic citizenship. And I want to address one of the sub-theme of the conference first, which is new public practices of reckoning with injustice. That requires a dimension of empathy and suspending the student self. We must encourage our students to proceed with radical empathy with those other than themselves, because in our often majority white classrooms, like they are at Puget Sound, we have the capacity to now give our students an opportunity to acquiesce and embody a role that is other than themselves, and hopefully learn a little something about the privileges and power, or lack thereof, that this might entail. But addressing specifically the main conference theme of radically reimagining the project of justice means that we demands, in fact, that we practice our anger. Because the media, the dominant narrative, expects us, when we resist as marginalized people, to get it right the first time. It expects professional, perfect, packaged resistance. But reacting allows us to practice a methodology. Again, embodiment of difference, and engaging in argument rather than reduction to biology. And thus it allows us to recenter our discourse around those voices that might have been lost in our curriculum. And as a result, we might say, for example, that surviving one tragedy, outcry over a single instance of injustice, does not prepare us for the next, nor should it. No tragedy should be practiced for the next. And thus we need a curricular and infrastructurally supported pedagogy to practice our anger and to practice our modes of resistance Because when we embody another, we are accessible to a new methodology, a new playful practice of creative disorder. And so my charge for you in the last few seconds I have in this presentation is that we must rupture this rigid student identity to begin broaching this idea of penetrating and dissolving the dominant narrative within our higher education or any educational space. But with reacting to the past, I hope that I've presented a compelling case for why that this pedagogy can in fact attempt to rupture these rigid identities of student, disrupt this hyper-specialized disciplinary mastery, and thus disrupt the dominant narrative. And so my hope to all of you is that we can all say, with reacting to the past, game on. Thank you.